driving more slowly, turning down the air conditioning, car-free Sundays, and working from home. The International Energy Agency is urging governments around the world to consider taking drastic steps to reduce global demand for oil. These measures were laid out in a 10-point emergency plan and aim to offset the substantial loss of Russian barrels from global markets. So for more on this, I want to welcome Bloomberg Opinion's Liam Denning. Liam, you've been writing about or working with the energy sector for almost 20 years. First of all, just explain to us here, when the IEA says that it recommends these steps, it says that it's part of this plan to address the fact that we are in a major energy crisis. Is the IEA exaggerating when it calls this a major crisis that's set to get worse over the next couple of years?
No, we're in a major crisis. I mean, Russia is the world's biggest oil exporter, the third biggest oil producer. It's also a major producer of natural gas. Western Europe is very dependent upon it, but it ships oil and gas all over the world. If that gets removed from the system, that's a huge deal. Remember, the oil market in particular is the kind of market that moves around on, a few 100,000 barrels a day. Here we're talking upwards of maybe 2.5 million barrels a day being taken out of the system. And I think what people aren't seeing, we've all seen the fluctuations in the oil price, but what they aren't seeing is perhaps a gathering crisis happening in the background, which I call a liquidity crisis, and it comes in two forms. One is capital is being withdrawn from the oil market in the sense of we're seeing a lot less trading in oil. Open positions are coming down. People are backing away from the market, and that's always a problem.
Fewer participants.
That's right. The second is liquidity in the form of barrels, barrels being withdrawn from the market. And in Russia's case, that's a real problem because at some point, if Russian supply is cut off from the market for long enough, it will back up in the Russian system. They'll be forced to shut in wells. And the one thing we know about the Russian oil system is it does not handle shut-ins very well. If that oil goes away, it's very hard to bring it back on.
It's not like a flip of the switch.
No, just by way of illustrating that, when oil production collapsed in Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it didn't get back to that level until 2016.
Okay. All right, so that's a pretty good indication that this is something that will persist for years to come, even if the war ends tomorrow, which it's unlikely to. So when you look at the IEA's prescription for the world, reduce its demand for oil, carpooling, relying more on public transportation, lower speed limits, using fuel-efficient trucks, all of which would be more environmentally sustainable as well. At the same time, though, these are not the only ways in which we use oil. There's lots of others, and there's a whole chart here that shows that there's numerous barrels of oil that are not accounted for it, that are just other, 910,000 barrels per day that's used on other things. What is some of the other things out there? Because people could reduce their use of oil in this way, and it still wouldn't really move the needle, would it?
Well, it could, if done at scale, it could move the needle. As I said, the oil market moves on very small fluctuations. If you manage to bring down demand by, say, 1 million barrels a day, that would have a big impact on the market. 1 million barrels a day is roughly how much demand tends to grow every year. So that's a fairly substantial number. Other ways in which we use oil are actually a little harder to get rid of. We obviously use a lot of oil in plastics, in making plastics. We use a lot of oil in industrial processes for heat, and it's very hard to switch those to other forms of energy quickly anyway.
Okay, so some of those measures that the IEA laid out might work in Europe, where there's a culture more of conserving, than perhaps here in the United States, where the conversation has bypassed conservation completely to just, let's increase production, drill, baby, drill. What is the likelihood that the IEA's message will resonate with any policymaker in the US, especially in a midterm election year?
I think you just answered the question with midterm election year. In the short term, probably not much. But I think it's worth remembering these are all things that the US has done in the past, like the whole 55 mile per hour speed limit. That was enforced from, I think, if I get my dates right, 1974 to 1987 or something like that.
That came out of the oil crisis?
Came out of the oil crisis, yeah.
Before then, people could go 60 or 70 miles an hour?
Well, I think the idea was it's set by states, but at that point they implemented some kind of federal kind of incentive system to get states to bring it down to 55. It happened in the Second World War, all again to conserve. The problem, obviously, is that conservation tends to have a bad name because we like to drive big trucks.
We like to do what we want to do. It's called freedom,
Right.
Liam.
It's called freedom. But, freedom is also not being beholden to foreign powers who are invading other countries. Freedom is also preserving the integrity of our atmosphere. There is a long overdue conversation. I mean, it has been happening, but it's obviously very polarized. A long overdue conversation that has to happen in the US about what are our priorities. The thing is, we're paying for all this stuff anyway, right? Security is a cost. The climate is a cost. It's not always transparent, but they are costs. And we have to decide how we're going to prioritize, our security versus adversaries versus our desire to, say, drive a 3-ton truck to the supermarket.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Let's back up for a moment here. The International Energy Agency, I learned, was formed in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis. What was its role back then? What has it evolved into today?
Well, it's essentially the consuming nation's counterpart to OPEC, right?
Okay.
It was designed to help countries that were importing a lot of oil to deal with the kind of shock that they faced in 1973. And so it's essentially served as kind of a coordinating body and talking shop for most of its life. There are, for example, IEA protocols about how much oil governments keep in storage to cope with emergencies like the one we have now. It has also taken on a kind of a data role over time, so it produces a lot of data to make us aware of how our energy system functions. But it's also become more of a policy instrument, and in some ways, it kind of raises raises ideas from time to time. And recently, it's obviously made a big push on the need for decarbonization and how we can move towards a net zero economy. And then in recent weeks, how we can deal with the fact that one of our largest oil suppliers has essentially challenged the international order.
So given that the IEA's history and its roots are in the 1973 oil crisis, can you talk a little bit about the parallels between what we had in 1973 and what we have today? I mean, could we have a situation where we are short of oil the way that we were in 1973, leading to all kinds of lines at gas stations and people really being worried that they couldn't get gas when they needed to?
It seems unlikely that we'll have shortages in that way for a couple of reasons. One is the US is now a kind of a net exporter of oil. It still imports oil, but its net balance is at zero. So, in theory, and I'm really going out on a limb here, if there was enough of an emergency, you could reimpose a ban on oil exports and keep all the oil in America. Now, that would have horrendous impacts on investment in the upstream because suddenly you'd have kind of a two-tier oil structure where
refiners would have to change everything,
more expensive elsewhere.
Yeah.
The other difference, I think, is that we sort of created our own problems in the 70s by also instituting things like price controls, which ended up exacerbating the situation. Now, in theory, if there is an extended war, if we were to see Russian oil completely taken out of the market, my guess is what would happen is prices would rise to such a level that people would conserve either at the behest of the government or they would just conserve because it's too expensive.
Yeah, they wouldn't take the next car trip. They wouldn't fly because it just costs too much money.
Or they would lose their job in a recession.
There's that as well. So the IEA's executive director, Fatih Birol, said that this time the energy crunch involves not just oil, but natural gas as well. And natural gas is important to Americans because it often heats a lot of the homes in the Northeast as well. Talk us through what a shortage or a crisis in natural gas looks like versus just a shortage of oil.
Well, for the US, that is less existential because the US is awash in natural gas. It exports a ton of natural gas. It would be exporting more if it had the facilities to do them. They simply haven't been built fast enough. It's a much bigger problem for Europe because Russia is the biggest source of gas imports into Western Europe. Countries like Germany are very dependent on gas. So there it's much more of an existential question. It's, are we going to have enough gas to heat ourselves? Now, the good thing is we're transitioning towards the summer, so European gas demand tends to go down. The problem you have is, over the summer is when Europe tends to build up its gas storage, and if that gets cut off from Russia, it's going to have to bid in a lot more gas from, say, cargoes that would otherwise go to Asia. They'll have to pay a lot more. There's a secondary way it hurts, which is a lot of the oil refineries in Europe, they run themselves with gas. So if the price of gas is high, it also forces up the oil price there.
This is the opposite of a virtuous cycle, right?
The vicious one, yeah.
So walk me through your biggest fear, your biggest concern that you'll be watching for in the next couple of weeks, in the next couple of months.
I mean, so let's leave aside the rather horrendous potential geopolitical concerns that could happen. I think the biggest concern is that you start to see the impact of cutoffs on the Russian oil system itself, that you start to see what I would call almost permanent destruction of Russian oil production capacity, because that is then going to be a structural headwind to the oil market. You're going to see very high prices. I think the other problem is if you see this war drag on and you see either Europe enact tougher sanctions or you see the Russians use the gas weapon and simply, take the hit of losing the revenue but cut off gas supply to Europe to hurt it, that will lead to all sorts of economic problems in Europe. I mean, almost certainly a recession, I would have thought, a pretty deep recession. And then real questions about how Europe is going to reconfigure itself quickly to deal with that kind of thing.
Yeah, and those kinds of economic problems lead to political change as well, of course. Bloomberg Opinion's Liam Denning, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Bloomberg Quicktake.